I've been a judge for over 10 years, and while I've handled thousands of cases, there are a handful that stay with me. Ones that make you question life, justice, and sometimes even yourself. This story isn't just about one of those cases. It's about a man who changed how I see the world. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in November when I first saw him. He shuffled into the courtroom, head down, his shoulders weighed by an invisible burden. His name was William Carter, but he introduced himself to the court as Will. He stood out, not just because of his disheveled appearance, but because of the way he carried himself. Quiet, resigned, but not entirely broken. Will had been charged with trespassing. He'd been caught sleeping in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building's owner wanted him fined, citing reputational damage and claiming Will had left trash behind. It was hard to imagine the man standing before me doing much damage to anything. His clothes were tattered, his hair unkempt, and his face told a story of hardship I couldn't fully comprehend. When I asked if he had anything to say for himself, Will's response was simple. "I was just trying to stay warm, Your Honor." His voice was soft, steady, and painfully honest. There was no excuse, no plea for pity, just the truth. I've learned to keep my emotions in check on the bench. But something about Will's quiet dignity struck me. The law, however, is the law. I had no choice but to impose the standard fine, $200. It was a small amount to most people, but for someone like Will it might as well have been $200,000. He nodded when I announced the fine, as if he'd expected no less. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said before being escorted out. Those words lingered with me long after he'd left the courtroom. Later that evening, I couldn't shake the image of Will from my mind. Over dinner with my husband, I found myself voicing the questions I couldn't ask in court. How does someone end up like that? No home, no help, no one to turn to. "Sometimes people just fall through the cracks," my husband said. "Doesn't mean they're not worth saving." That's the thing about my job. It's easy to get jaded, to see people as case numbers instead of human beings. But Will reminded me of something I'd started to forget. Every person who stands in front of me has a story. A life that brought them to this moment. His story wasn't over yet. A week later, I got a call from an attorney named Thomas Jenkins. "Judge Reynolds, I'm reaching out about a man who appeared in your courtroom recently. William Carter. We've been trying to locate him for months, and by sheer luck, we found him because of the court records." "Locate him?" I asked, puzzled. "Why?" That's when Jenkins told me something that sounded more like a plot twist from a movie than real life. Will was the sole heir to an estate worth millions of dollars. His grandfather, a wealthy businessman, had passed away 6 months earlier. But finding Will had been nearly impossible. His mother had been estranged from the family for decades, and after her death, Will had fallen off the radar entirely. "Are you sure it's the same William Carter?" I asked, struggling to wrap my head around what I was hearing. "We're certain," Jenkins replied. "We just need him to come in and sign the paperwork to claim his inheritance." The next day, Will was back in my courtroom, though this time not as a defendant. I had arranged for Jenkins to meet him there. Will looked confused and wary as he walked in, his worn shoes shuffling against the polished floor. "Mr. Carter," I began, "someone's here to speak with you about your future." Jenkins stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Carter, my name is Thomas Jenkins. I represent the estate of your late grandfather, George Whittaker." Will blinked at him, clearly not understanding. "I don't have a grandfather," he said flatly. "You did," Jenkins replied gently. "He passed away earlier this year and left everything to you. Mr. Carter, you're a very wealthy man." The courtroom was silent. For a moment, I thought Will hadn't heard him. Then, with a nervous laugh, he said, "You must have the wrong guy. I don't even have enough for a sandwich, let alone." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's not a mistake," Jenkins assured him. "You are George Whittaker's only living relative. Everything he owned now belongs to you." Will sat down as if his legs could no longer hold him. He buried his face in his hands and didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. When he finally looked up, his eyes were glistening with tears. I don't even know what to say." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Will. With Jenkins' help, he claimed the inheritance, a sprawling estate multiple businesses, and a bank account that most people could only dream of. The transformation was remarkable. Will cleaned up, traded his threadbare clothes for a tailored suit, and walked with a confidence that hadn't been there before. But what struck me most was that he didn't let the money change who he was at his core. Instead of retreating into a life of luxury, Will focused on giving back. He used a portion of his inheritance to start a foundation for the homeless. "No one should have to go through what I went through," he said during the foundation's opening ceremony. "If I can help even one person find their way back, it'll all be worth it." He hired people who had lived on the streets, giving them jobs, training, and hope. He renovated shelters, funded mental health programs, and partnered with local organizations to provide meals and clothing to those in need. His foundation didn't just offer temporary relief, it gave people the tools to rebuild their lives. I kept in touch with Will, not out of professional obligation, but because his journey inspired me. One day over coffee, I asked him how he felt about everything that had happened. "Grateful," he said without hesitation, "but also guilty. There are so many people out there who are still struggling. I was lucky, but not everyone gets a second chance." "You're making the most of it, though," I pointed out. He smiled. "I'm trying. For every night I spent on the street, for every door that was slammed in my face, I'm trying to make it right." Will's story taught me something I'd forgotten. The law might be blind, but compassion doesn't have to be. Every person who stands in my courtroom has a story, and sometimes it's worth looking beyond the facts to see the human being beneath. Will Carter reminded me of that. To this day, when I'm faced with a difficult case or a defendant who seems beyond help, I think of Will. Because sometimes life surprises you. Sometimes the person you least expect to make a difference ends up changing everything.